Batman the Animated Series was the definitive adaptation of The Dark Knight and is today revered as one of the greatest animated shows ever produced. Starring the talents of Kevin Conroy, Mark Hamill, Arlene Sorkin, and many, many more, BTAS glided onto screens in 1992 and made Saturday morning its own. The show set out to prove that children's TV could be genuinely smart and engaging, stunning viewers with dark imagery and even darker themes. The entire project was a massive undertaking, and it's no surprise that a whole host of fascinating what-if moments and stories emerge from behind the scenes during and post-production. So, I'm Ewan, this is What Culture Comics, and here are 10 mind-blowing facts you didn't know about Batman the Animated Series. Number 10. Paul Dini came this close to making a Sandman crossover episode. If Batman the Animated Series was the best superhero effort of the 90s, then Vertigo Comics was the best comics thing in general about that decade. An imprint of DC, Vertigo was the publisher's mature readers line and featured a whole host of great properties, including Hellblazer, a book focusing on John Constantine that span out of Swamp Thing, and Sandman, a Neil Gaiman-fronted comic that revolved around Dream of the Endless, the ruler of the dream world. Although Vertigo was a DC imprint, it would be years until their characters would develop a certain kind of link to the main DCU. It's with that in mind that it should be surprising to learn that BTAS writer Paul Dini approached Gaiman about including Morpheus, a character from the comic, in an episode of the show. Gaiman was reportedly enthused by the prospect, but the show's producers were supposedly put off by the idea of including a character intended for mature audiences in their animated children's show. Tragically, there were plenty of other seriously brilliant-sounding episodes that never ended up seeing the light of day. The show's writers had planned a Cattlemen and Black Canary team-up only for it to be shelved by Fox, who demanded Robin appear in every episode. Alan Burnett had also optioned an episode called The Gun Story, which would have followed the life of a firearm from it being built all the way up to it being used in a crime in Gotham. Bruce Timm even had a plan to make an episode where Batman would have been turned into a vampire, and while he did get to live out that concept in the criminally overlooked Justice League Gods and Monsters, it's still a shame we never got to see it. Speaking of, go watch my review of that film. It's really good. Both the review and the film. Number 9. There were some seriously cool lost episodes. Longtime fans of BTAS will no doubt be aware of the DC animated universe. The show spawned an entire universe of spin-offs and animated films that are all equally as beloved as BTAS itself, but the DCAU wasn't just restricted to the animated medium. Video games and comics all formed a part of this particular franchise, and while discerning their canonicity can prove arduous, a lot can effectively be dubbed lost episodes. The first and most well-known came in the Adventures of Batman and Robin video game, which released in 1994. The title featured a brand new story where most of the cast from the animated series reprised their roles, and while the animation is nowhere near the quality of the actual show itself, it's still worth watching for die-hard fans. Other video games like Batman Vengeance and Rise of Sin Tzu further expanded upon BTAS, albeit after it became the new Batman Adventures. The former was really quite underrated and was genuinely really dark, pitting Batman against the Joker and the GCPD. The latter, meanwhile, wasn't as successful, but it did introduce a new character in Sin Tzu. There was also a spin-off comic called Shadow of Sin Tzu, which even featured Cassandra Cain's Batgirl in a minor role. It does not, however, appear to be a part of official continuity. Outside of the games, numerous comics centered around BTAS were released from the mid-90s onwards. They're genuinely brilliant, and one in particular, The Lost Years, even fills in the gaps between BTAS and the new Batman Adventures. Go check it out if you're in the mood for more. Number 8. Some voice actors were involved in live-action DC efforts. Although BTAS divested heavily from the Silver Age silliness of the 60s Batman show, it didn't dismiss it entirely. The late great Adam West even starred in one of the most affecting episodes of the show in Beware the Grey Ghost, where he portrayed an actor who played the vigilante that inspired a young Bruce Wayne to take up crime fighting. Outside of West, there were other guest actors on BTAS who had roles on the 60s show and other live-action Bat media. Roddy McDowall, the voice of the Mad Hatter, had previously portrayed Bookworm on the earlier series, while Riddler voice actor John Glover portrayed Jason Woodrue in 1997's Batman and Robin, and later Lionel Luthor on Smallville. He even portrayed the father of Dr. Sivana in 2019 Shazam. Number 7. Kevin Conroy was the first actor to have Batman disguise his voice. By now, it should come as no surprise to learn that BTAS was highly influential on comics, film, animation, and TV. One of its biggest impacts, however, is down to Kevin Conroy's performance as Batman. It was Conroy who was the first to have Bruce Wayne disguise his voice as the Dark Knight, and it's a trend that's stuck ever since, disqualifying Batman and Robin, of course. Although Conroy later switched up his technique to showcase the all-encompassing nature of the Bat, to begin with, there was a clear delineation between his voice for Bruce and his nighttime alter ego. That was all Conroy's idea, although fans do have Andrea Romano to thank for recruiting all the DCAU's acting talent in the first place, and for specifying that Bruce Wayne's voice had to be sexy more than anything else. Ooh la la. Pretty much every actor who plays Batman decides to switch up their voice when switching between Bruce and the Bat. Another example of the animated series' enduring legacy. Number 6. The series font was used on Murray Franklin's show in Joker 2019. Even though Joker 2019 takes most of its inspiration from the works of Martin Scorsese, they did find time to pay homage to Batman the Animated Series in one very specific way. Robert De Niro's Murray Franklin is a central figure in Joker, and a partial catalyst for Arthur Fleck's descent into madness. Arthur idolizes Murray, whose show, Live with Murray Franklin, dominates the airwaves every weekend, just like BTAS did every Saturday morning, except, you know, a lot more cheerily. Anyway, those who paid close attention to Murray's scenes will have noticed that the show borrowed the exact same font used in Batman the Animated Series, called Plaza. It's instantly recognizable as BTAS's lettering, so it's highly unlikely this was anything but a deliberate nod to the show. Number 5. The reason why it changed the adventures of Batman and Robin. Batman the Animated Series tends to denote pretty much every incarnation the show went through, which includes both the adventures of Batman and Robin and the new Batman Adventures. While the reason for the change to TNBA was fairly obvious and publicly documented, the explanation for the first name change isn't so well known. The showrunners behind BTAS have frequently discussed their battles with Fox over the direction of the series, and it's also the reason why the show underwent a name change for its final 15 episodes. Not content with giving pages upon pages of feedback to BTAS's writers on what they could and couldn't depict, Fox also asked that they change the name of BTAS to include Robin, and to include the character as much as possible. Fortunately for the writers, Robin was already one of the show's best characters. Sadly though, Fox's restrictions meant that certain episodes never saw the light of day, the aforementioned Canary Cattlemen story being just one of them. Robin had to be in everything, and it was only when the series made the jump to the WB that BTAS's showrunners were given greater creative freedom. Number 4. A ton of big-name actors were approached for different parts. Batman the Animated Series voice cast wasn't short of celebrity, but there was a time when the showrunners approached some serious Hollywood royalty for certain roles. Al Pacino was approached for the part of Two-Face, which eventually went to Richard Mole, while the likes of Patrick Stewart and Anthony Hopkins were also considered for Mr. Freeze, who was eventually portrayed by the late Michael Ansara. All things said and done, it's difficult to imagine Pacino as Two-Face, especially since he's never done voice acting before. While Ansara was so iconic as Mr. Freeze, it seems almost ridiculous to suggest anyone else could have taken the part. Elsewhere, one of the more famous what-if castings involves Tim Curry, who was initially cast as the Joker until he was forced down because of bronchial infection. You can actually hear his laugh in Be a Clown, but his actual recorded sessions as the Clown Prince remain sadly ever elusive. Lastly, Sir Christopher Lee was also considered to voice Ra's al Ghul, according to Andrea Romano herself. David Warner was obviously brilliant in that role, but Lee? That would have really been something. Number 3. The series was so dark it was boarded on black paper. BTAS was dark. Like, not just totally, I mean literally. Bruce Timm, Eric Radomski, and the others behind the series took inspiration from both Tim Burton's '89 Batman film and the Fleischer Superman shorts of the 1930s to create their timeless Art Deco version of Gotham. It was imposing, a character in and of itself, and part of that was down to a brainwave from Radomski. Wanting BTAS's backgrounds to stand out from other shows, the producer decided that all of them should be painted on black paper. The effects were extraordinary, and no doubt contributed to the unique tone and feel the series boasted in its earlier seasons. Number 2. Robin's older age was down to censorship rules. In what could be considered a happy accident, given how it enabled BTAS to depict Robin's transformation into Nightwing, the reason why Dick Grayson was depicted as a university student in the show was actually down to censorship rules. BTAS had to abide by a lot of censors during those seasons with Fox, one of the most divisive relating to the endangerment of children. Although Dick Grayson's Robin was commonly depicted as a child in most Bat-related media up until BTAS, the show decided to showcase the character as a young adult to please the censors. The only time audiences ever saw Grayson's childhood was in the Emmy Award-winning two-parter, Robin's Reckoning, which also found itself unintentionally aided by censorship, when the episode depicted the deaths of Grayson's parents in a flashback off-screen. It was only when BTAS moved to the WB that a younger Robin, Tim Drake, a mishmash of Drake and the hot-blooded Jason Todd, came aboard. And number 1, a sequel series about Cattlemen ended up getting scrapped. Cattlemen may not have had the biggest role throughout betas, but she was a clear fan favourite and, as the character's history has shown time and time again, was clearly more than capable of anchoring her own series. It's with this in mind that Fox approached Bruce Timm about the prospect of developing a spin-off based on Selena Kyle shortly after betas' debut, with Timm developing a series of sketches soon after. Only a small amount of production work was ever completed on the Catwoman spin-off though, with WB eventually electing to pursue a Superman cartoon instead. Superman the Animated Series is definitely overlooked when compared to betas, and while it's easy to understand why WB opted for the Man of Steel over Catwoman, is there not some world out there we might have had both? Interestingly, according to World's Finest, this wasn't the last time a Catwoman series situated within the DCAU would get optioned. A series co-led by Selena and Nightwing was eventually pitched, as was a Birds of Prey show that also tragically never saw the light of day. Oh, what could have been.